The screaming stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m. on October 13, 1982. But the dogs in Harlan County kept howling until dawn. This wasn't the first time silence had fallen like a blade across the Cumberland Mountains, cutting through the night air thick with cold dust and secrets that festered in the hollow's belly. What happened in those Kentucky hills over 3 decades reveals how isolation can twist a bloodline into something unrecognizable, and how an entire community can choose blindness over truth. The creak of rotting porch boards, the metallic tang of rusted well water, the damp earth that never quite dried. Textures of Copperhead Hollow, a place where the McCready family had lived, bred, and buried their sins for over a century. Population, 43 souls, though counting souls in Copperhead Hollow always proved tricky. The hollow stretched like a scar between 2 ridges, accessible only by a gravel road that the county stopped maintaining. Sometime in the 1960s, mail came twice a week when the postal worker remembered electricity arrived. Here in 1974, but most families still used kerosene lamps out of habit or stubborn pride. The McCready compound sat at the hollow's dead end, where the creek bent around a cluster of trailers and lentos that seemed to multiply like mushrooms after rain. By 1980, 3 generations of Mercedes lived within shouting distance of each other. 6 children and a growing brood of grandchildren whose parentage blurred like watercolors in rain. The family tree looked more like a thorn bush, tangled, dense, and dangerous to touch. County records showed 14 births at the compound between 1975 and 1982, but only 9 death certificates were ever filed. The first hint that something had gone wrong came from a social worker named Margaret Finley, who made the mistake of trying to enroll the McCready children in school. Her report, dated September 5, 1981, described severe developmental delays consistent with prolonged isolation and possible nutritional deficiencies. She noted that several children appeared to share identical facial features, despite being listed as cousins rather than siblings. More disturbing was her observation that the youngest children seemed unnaturally fearful of adults outside the family unit. Report: mountain families had their ways, he reasoned, and the McDight weren't bothering anyone. Besides, Ezekiel McCready had friends in the sheriff's department, men who remembered when his moonshine had kept their own families fed during the lean years. Some silences the mountains teach you are worth keeping. But the hollow itself began to change. Hunters reported that game trails avoided the McCready property, as if the animals sensed something predators instinctively fear. The creek that ran past their compound started running murky year-round, thick with sediment that didn't match the local geology. And at night, when the wind was right, neighbors heard sounds that didn't belong to any creature they recognized. Something was growing in the dark. The summer of 1982, the youngest McCready children had stopped venturing beyond the tree and that marked their property. The older ones emerged only to trade pelts and mason jars of clear liquid for supplies in town, their eyes never quite meeting those of the store clerks who served them. They moved with a careful silence of people who had learned that noise invited attention and attention invited pain. You do if you suspected something unspeakable was happening just 5 miles from your own home, but every instinct told you that looking too closely might make you the next victim. Came on that October night when Deputy Sheriff Michael Torres decided to investigate reports of gunshots from the hollow and discovered that some family trees grow their roots and ground too poison to sustain anything resembling humanity. Deputy Michael Torres had seen plenty of mountain families living rough, but the smell hit him before he'd even stepped out of his patrol car. Sweet decay mixed with wood smoke and something else that made his stomach turn. This wasn't poverty. This was something that had learned to hide behind poverty's familiar face. What Torres found that night would haunt Kentucky State Police files for decades, becoming the kind of case that veteran investigators whispered about in break rooms and rookie cops weren't allowed to touch. The gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the main trailer, a double wide that sagged in the middle like a broken spine. His flashlight beam caught movement in the window shadows that seemed to dart away from the light with unnatural speed. Copper and fear. 3 children emerged from behind a rusted pickup truck, ages impossible to determine. They might have been 8 or 18. Malnutrition and something else had stunted their growth in ways that defied easy categorization. Their clothes hung in tatters, but their eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost feral, watching, calculating, waiting. The oldest, a girl with matted hair that might once have been blonde, spoke in a dialect so thick that Torres had to strain to understand. "Supposed to be here after dark," she said, her voice carrying an authority that belonged to someone much older. "Granddaddy don't like strangers." Torres identified himself, explained he was responding to reports of gunfire. The children exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes without words. The girl tilted her head toward the largest trailer, where warm light leaked through torn curtains. Through the thin walls, Torres could hear what sounded like a family dinner, the clink of utensils, low conversation, someone laughing at a joke he couldn't quite make out. His radio crackled. "Unit 7. What's your status?" Torres hesitated. Protocol demanded he call for backup, but backup was 40 minutes away on mountain roads that turned treacherous after dark. The children watched him with the patience of hunters who had learned to wait for their prey to make the first mistake. When he knocked on the trailer door, the sounds inside stopped immediately. Complete silence, as if everyone had simply vanished. Then slow footsteps, deliberate and measured. The door opened to reveal Ezekiel McCready himself, a man Torres recognized from old arrest photos, though the years had carved him into something harder and more angular. His smile revealed teeth filed to points, a modification Torres had never seen outside of prison gang files. "Deputy, bit late for social calls, ain't it?" Behind Ezekiel, Torres could see into the trailer's main room. A long table dominated the space, set for what appeared to be a feast. Steam rose from serving dishes, and the rich smell of cooked meat filled the air. But something about the scene felt wrong. The proportions were off. The shadows fell at strange angles, and the other family members who sat around the table seemed frozen in place, their forks halfway to their mouths. The feast that never ended. Torres counted 7 adults, and at least a dozen children, though in the dim light it was hard to tell where one person ended and another began. Sat so they might have been mannequins except for their eyes, which tracked his every movement with the focused attention of predators evaluating a potential meal. Just checking on reports of gunshots, Torres managed, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon, making sure everyone's safe. Ezekiel's filed teeth caught the light as his smile widened. "Safe as houses, deputy, just doing a little night hunting. These mountains, they're full of things that only come out after dark." The statement hung in the air like smoke from a funeral. Torres knew he should press further, demand to search the property, assert his authority as a law enforcement officer. Watching him from inside the trailer held a hunger that transcended mere poverty or desperation, something that had been feeding for a long time and had developed a taste for more than just the deer and rabbits that roam these hills. What does a lawman do when he realizes that some laws were never meant to reach into certain dark corners of the world? Toward his patrol car, he caught sight of something that would appear in his nightmares for years to come. Bicycle partially buried behind the main trailer, its small wheels still spinning. slowly, in the mountain breeze. The bicycle belonged to Amy Chen, age 7, who had disappeared from a camping trip near Pine Mountain State Park 6 months earlier. Torres recognized it. Immediately, the purple frame with silver streamers that had been plastered across every missing person flyer in eastern Kentucky. This single piece of evidence transformed what might have been dismissed as mountain eccentricity into something far more sinister, connecting the McCready compound to a string of disappearances that stretched back nearly 2 decades. Torres photographed the bicycle with hands that shook despite his years of training. Streamers moved in the night breeze like fingers beckoning him deeper into the hollow secrets. State police records would later reveal a pattern that local law enforcement had somehow failed to notice. Children vanishing along a corridor that stretched from Harland County north through Pike and Floyd counties, always from families who were camping, hiking, or traveling through the remote mountain areas. 23 children between the ages of 5 and 12 had gone missing in that region. Since 1964, 23 families left to wonder what had happened to their sons and daughters in the vast wilderness of Appalachian Kentucky. The official explanation was always the same. Children wandered off, got lost in the dense forest, fell into hidden mine shafts or swift-running creeks. The mountains were dangerous, rangers explained to grieving parents. Accidents happened. Bodies were rarely recovered in terrain that rugged, and families were encouraged to find closure without physical remains. But Torres now understood that some of those children had never been lost at all. They had been found inside his patrol car. Torres radioed for backup and requested immediate contact with the state police. But as he spoke into the microphone, he became aware that shapes were moving in the darkness around his vehicle, hiding places, and were circling his car with the coordinated precision of a pack. Their movements were silent, deliberate, and utterly inhuman in their synchronization. The oldest girl appeared at his passenger window, her face pressed against the glass. In the green glow of his dashboard lights, Torres could see that her canine teeth had been filed to points just like her grandfather's. She mouthed words he couldn't hear through the glass, but her meaning was clear. He wasn't leaving the hollow tonight. Static. No matter how he adjusted the frequency, he couldn't raise dispatch. The children began rocking his patrol car, gently at first, then with increasing violence. Torres drew his service weapon, but found himself unable to aim it at children, even children whose eyes reflected light like nocturnal predators and whose fingernails had been sharpened into claws. The innocence that was never innocent. From his police academy training, Torres remembered reading about the Sunny Bean clan in 16th century Scotland, a family of cannibals who had preyed on travelers for decades. The case had been presented as historical curiosity, an example of how isolation could corrupt human nature. But sitting in his patrol car surrounded by the McCready children, Torres realized that some horrors didn't stay buried in the history books. A report filed by Kentucky State Police Detective Frank Morrison on November 2, 1982, would later describe finding evidence of systematic predation at the McCready compound. Morrison's team discovered personal belongings from at least 15 missing children hidden throughout the property, along with crude drawings that appeared to show hunting techniques specifically adapted for capturing young humans. But on that October night, Torres had only his instincts and his growing certainty that he had stumbled into something that would challenge every assumption he'd ever made about the nature of evil. The children stopped rocking his car and began to sing a lullaby in that same thick dialect, their voices harmonizing in ways that human voices shouldn't be able to harmonize. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and Torres found himself growing drowsy, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Understood with crystalline clarity that this was how they had lured the camping children away from their families with songs that promised safety and warmth, and something that looked like love from a distance. What kind of family teaches its children to hunt other children? And what kind of society allows such a family to perfect their techniques across multiple generations? As the singing grew louder, Torres saw lights approaching through the trees, not the searchlights of his backup, but the flickering glow of torches carried by the adult members of the McCready clan moving toward his position with the patient inevitability of a rising tide. The torches moved through the trees like fallen stars, each flame casting dancing shadows that transformed the familiar forest into a maze of lurking threats. Torres counted at least 12 figures approaching from different directions, their movements coordinated with the precision of hunters who had practiced this dance many times before. Wasn't random violence or desperate poverty. This was a family business that had been refined across generations, passed down like recipes or farming techniques. The radio in Torres's patrol car had gone completely dead, not even static, breaking the electronic silence. His backup wasn't coming, and even if it was, 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours. Ezekiel McCready emerged from the largest trailer carrying what appeared to be a modified hunting rifle, its barrel shortened and its stock carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. Behind him walked a woman Torres hadn't seen before, tall, gaunt, with iron-gray hair, braided with what looked like small bones. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That's Granny McCready," the girl at his window whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "She's the one who teaches us the old ways, the hungry ways." Torres tried his engine. It turned over once, then died with a mechanical wheeze that sounded almost like laughter. The children began backing away from his car, their job apparently finished. Whatever they had done to disable his vehicle, they had done it quietly and efficiently, while he'd been distracted by their singing. A Kentucky State Police forensics report dated December 15, 1982, would later detail the modifications found throughout the McCready compound. Hidden pits covered with branches and leaves, snare traps sized for small humans, and a network of underground tunnels that connected the various trailers and outbuildings. The family had turned their entire property into a hunting preserve designed for one specific type of prey. But Torres didn't know about the tunnels. Yet, he didn't know about the preservation techniques the family had developed or the careful record-keeping that tracked each victim's age, weight, and nutritional value. All he knew was that he was trapped in a place where the normal rules of civilization had been suspended for so long that their absence had become a tradition. The torchbearers had formed a loose circle around his patrol car, staying just beyond the reach of his headlights. They weren't advancing yet, but they weren't retreating either. They were waiting for something, a signal perhaps, or simply the right moment. Torres had investigated enough hunting accidents to recognize the behavior, their prey time to exhaust itself with panic before moving in for the kill. The patient hunger. Granny McCready raised one skeletal hand, and the circling figures stopped moving. Her voice carried clearly across the hollow, speaking in that same thick dialect, but with an authority that made the words sound like ancient incantations. "Been a long time since we had a Salem man. Last one was back in '68 state trooper who got too curious about the missing hikers." Torres felt his blood turn to ice. He remembered that case from the Academy trooper Daniel Kellerman, who had vanished while investigating reports of missing campers in the Daniel Boone National Forest. His patrol car had been found abandoned near a hiking trail. Doors open, radio still crackling with unanswered calls from dispatch. The official report listed him as missing and presumed dead, victim of a hiking accident or possible foul play by unknown perpetrators. Danny Kellerman fought real good. Granny McCritty continued, her voice carrying a note of professional respect. Took 3 of the boys to bring him down, but he was tough, eating all muscle and gristle. You look like you might be more tender. The children had completely disappeared now, melting back into the darkness with supernatural silence. That they would be taking positions around his vehicle, cutting off any possible escape routes. Been perfecting their hunting techniques for decades, and he was about to become their latest field test. What do you do when you realize that the badge and uniform that represent law and mean nothing to people who have created their own system of justice, one based on hunger rather than morality? Responding to some unheard signal, the torchbearers began moving again, closing their circle with the methodical patience of people who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Decision in the space between heartbeats. He wasn't going to die sitting in a disabled patrol car like a gift-wrapped present. He kicked open his door and rolled into the darkness beyond his headlights, using every shadow and depression in the ground to stay hidden from the advancing torchbearers. This desperate gamble would save his life, but it would also reveal the true scope of what the McCritty family had built in their isolated hollow over the course of 3 generations. The ground beneath Torres's feet felt wrong too. Soft in some places, too firm in others, as if the earth itself had been extensively modified. Within minutes of leaving his vehicle, he discovered why. His foot broke through what appeared to be solid ground, revealing a carefully camouflaged entrance to a tunnel system that honeycombed the entire hollow. The tunnels were hand-dug, but expertly reinforced with salvaged timber and corrugated metal, creating a subterranean network that connected every building on the Mardy property. More disturbing were the side chambers. He glimpsed by the light of his failing flashlight small cell-like spaces with heavy wooden doors and crude ventilation systems. A forensic anthropologist's report filed 6 months later would describe finding the remains of at least 37 individuals in various stages of preservation throughout the tunnel system. Dr. Prusant Sarah Martinez's clinical language couldn't quite mask her horror. Evidence suggests systematic processing of human remains for consumption, with particular attention paid to preservation techniques that would extend storage time in the humid mountain environment. But Torres didn't have the luxury of clinical detachment. He could hear the MacDirs above ground coordinating their search with whistles and calls that sounded more animal than human. Torchlight occasionally filtered down through hidden openings, creating moving patterns of light and shadow that made navigation through the tunnels a nightmare of wrong turns and dead ends. In one of the side chambers, Torres discovered something that nearly broke his sanity. Children's clothing, neatly folded and organized by size. Tiny shoes arranged in rows, stuffed animals positioned as if they were still being played with, and scratched into the wooden walls, dozens of names with dates beside them, creating a ledger of victims that stretched back to 1959. Inventory of innocence. Some of the dates corresponded to missing children cases Torres recognized from his police training. Others were so old that the families who had lost those children were probably dead themselves. McCritty family had been hunting for over 2 decades, perfecting their techniques and expanding their territory. With each successful kill, near the bottom of one wall, scratched in a child's uncertain handwriting, Torres found a message that stopped him cold. "My name is Tommy Walsh. Today is my birthday. I am 8 years old. If someone finds this, tell my mom and dad I love them, and I'm sorry I went with the singing lady." The entry was dated August 12, 1979. Torres remembered the case. Tommy Walsh had disappeared during a family camping trip in the Daniel Boone National Forest. His parents had spent their life savings on private investigators and psychics, never knowing that their son had survived long enough to carve his final message into the wall of an underground prison. Above ground, the search was getting closer. Torres could hear footsteps directly overhead and voices discussing the best way to flush him out of the tunnels. Mentioned flooding the system with smoke. Another voice suggested using the dogs, though Torres hadn't seen any dogs on the property. Then he realized they weren't talking about animals. Loose the young ones. Granny McCrady's voice echoed down through the tunnel system. They know these holes better than anybody, and they can smell fear from a mile away. The sounds that began filtering down from above weren't quite human. A mixture of excited yipping and what might have been laughter, if laughter could carry such hunger and anticipation. Being released into the tunnel system, and Torres understood with crystal clarity that they had been raised for exactly this purpose. What happens to children who are taught that other children are food? And how do you fight enemies who have never learned the difference between hunting and playing? In the distance, Torres could hear them coming. The scrabble of small hands and feet moving through the tunnels with a confidence of creatures who had spent their entire lives in this underground maze. The sounds approaching through the tunnels weren't quite footsteps and weren't quite crawling, something in between that made Torres's skin crawl with evolutionary dread. The McCready children moved through their underground domain with the fluid grace of creatures perfectly adapted to their environment. This was their true home, not the ramshackle trailers above ground that served merely as camouflage for visiting outsiders. Down here in the darkness, the children had been transformed into something that belonged more in nightmares than in any recognizable version of human society. Their eyes had adapted to the perpetual gloom. Hearing had sharpened to detect the slightest movement, and their understanding of morality had been shaped by lessons that no child should ever learn. Torres pressed himself into a narrow alcove and tried to control his breathing as small shapes flitted past in the tunnel beyond. They communicated in whispers and clicks that seemed to function as a complete language, coordinating their search with the efficiency of a military unit. There was something else in their voices. Excitement, anticipation, kind of joy that normal children might show while playing hide and seek. This was play. The distinction between hunting and games had been erased so early in their development that they literally couldn't tell the difference between stalking a deer and stalking a human being. Psychology evaluation conducted months later by Dr. Robert Chen would describe this as complete moral dissociation resulting from systematic conditioning during critical developmental periods. In the main tunnel, Torres could hear them discussing strategy in their peculiar dialect. The oldest girl, the one who had spoken to him at his patrol, Tia, seemed to be directing the others with the casual authority of someone accustomed to command. She was perhaps 14, but her voice carried the cold calculation of a seasoned predator. "Deputy man scared," she said to her siblings. "Can smell it on him. Thick as molasses. But he's trying to be quiet, so he's probably military trained. To be smart about this." Another voice, younger but equally confident, found his blood trail where he scraped his hand on the rocks. "He's moving toward the old processing rooms, the education of monsters." Torres realized with growing horror that he was bleeding from a cut he'd sustained while crawling through the tunnel entrance. In the darkness he hadn't noticed the wound, but the children's enhanced senses had picked up the scent immediately. He was leaving a trail as clear as breadcrumbs, leading them directly to his hiding place. A case file from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit compiled in 1983 would later detail the sophisticated psychological conditioning that had created these children. Dr. Jennifer Hayes wrote, "The subjects display complete absence of empathy for victims outside their family unit, combined with highly developed tactical intelligence and pack-hunting behaviors typically seen only in apex predators. Academic analysis couldn't capture the pure terror of being hunted by children who giggled while they planned your death." Torres heard them discussing which tunnels to block off, how to drive him toward the meat rooms, and whether they should take him alive or kill him quickly. Their voices held the same casual tone that normal children might use while deciding what game to play next. The oldest girl's voice came from much closer now. "Found where he's hiding. Can hear his heart beating from here. Sounds like a scared rabbit." Torres realized they had pinpointed his location with frightening accuracy. Desperation. He began moving deeper into the tunnel system, hoping to find another exit, or at least a more defensible position. But every turn seemed to lead to another dead end, or another chamber filled with evidence of the family's decades-long hunting spree. In one room, he discovered what appeared to be a primitive but effective preservation facility. Hooks, salt barrels, and cutting tools arranged with the orderly precision of a commercial butcher shop. The walls were lined with crude drawings that seemed to show different dismemberment techniques, annotated in the careful handwriting of someone who took pride in their craft. What kind of family passes down knowledge of human butchery the way normal families might share recipes or farming techniques? Behind him, Torres could hear the children had stopped their pursuit. They were whispering among themselves, and there was something different in their tone now, not excitement, but concern. Heard the oldest girl's voice, sharp with alarm. "Somebody's coming. People got to get back upstairs." Through the tunnel walls, Torres could hear the distant sound of vehicle engines and shouting voices. His backup had finally arrived. The cavalry arrived in the form of 6 Kentucky State Police cruisers and 2 FBI vehicles, their red and blue lights turning the hollow into a strobing nightmare that revealed just how extensive the McCreed compound truly was. But the federal agents had come for reasons that went far beyond one missing deputy. This raid was the culmination of a 2-year investigation that had connected the disappearances in eastern Kentucky to a broader pattern of missing persons cases across 3 states, all linked by a single common thread. Families who had been living off the grid for generations, sustained by resources that couldn't be accounted for through any legitimate means. Mocrates were just one branch of a network that stretched deep into the most isolated corners of Appalachian America. Special Agent Patricia Valdez had been tracking this network since 1980, when a routine audit of missing persons reports had revealed statistical anomalies that couldn't be explained by accident or coincidence. Children were disappearing in areas where certain families had historical claims to large tracts of remote land. Too many of those disappearances followed similar patterns. Families camping or hiking, children who wandered away from supervised areas, searches that yielded no physical evidence. Operation Tonight was named Harvest Moon, a designation that would prove grimly appropriate given what the investigators were about to uncover. As tourists emerged from the tunnel system, covered in dirt and blood and babbling about underground chambers filled with children's clothing, the full scope of the horror began to unfold. Agent Vald's team moved through the compound with military precision, their tactical lights revealing details that the torch light had mercifully concealed. The main trailer contained a kitchen that had been modified for processing large quantities of meat with industrial-grade grinders and preservation equipment that no normal family would ever need. Freezer units hummed with electrical power diverted illegally from county lines, the infrastructure of appetite, but it was the children who presented the most complex challenge for law enforcement, ranging in age from 5 to 17. They had been so thoroughly conditioned by their environment that they couldn't understand why the raid was taking place. When agents attempted to separate them from the adult family members, several became violent, attacking officers with the coordinated ferocity of wild animals defending their pack. A psychological evaluation report, filed by Dr. Maria Santos on December 3, 1982, described the children as functionally feral, displaying attachment behaviors typical of trauma bonding, but directed toward perpetrators rather than protective figures. The youngest ones had never attended school, never interacted with outsiders, never learned that the world contained any other way of living. Granny McCready, when finally cornered in the main trailer, showed no remorse or even comprehension that she'd done anything wrong. Her statement to investigators, recorded on October 14, 1982, revealed the twisted logic that had sustained the family's predation for decades. Ain't no different than hunting deer or rabbits. World's got too many people anyway. We just doing what nature intended, strong, eating the weak. Evidence recovered from the compound filled 3 FBI warehouse facilities. Personal belongings from victims dating back to the 1950s, detailed records of each kill, including weights, ages, and what the family termed meat quality assessments. Photographs that documented the family's evolution from occasional opportunistic predation to systematic hunting operations. Perhaps most disturbing were the training materials, crude manuals, that documented techniques for luring children away from their families, methods for quickly disabling adult victims, and preservation techniques that maximized the usable yield from each kill. The MacDads had turned cannibalism into a science complete with research notes and experimental data. Been raised to see other children as livestock. And how do you rehabilitate minds that have never learned the most basic human to boss? The answers to those questions would challenge the criminal justice system for years to come. The immediate priority was determining just how many other families might be operating similar hunting grounds throughout the remote corners of America. As dawn broke over Copperhead Hollow, revealing the full extent of the underground tunnel system and the carefully concealed killing grounds, Agent Valdez received a radio call that chilled her blood. Similar compounds had been identified in West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, all connected by family ties and shared methodologies that suggested a coordinated network spanning multiple generations. The phone calls started coming in before the sun had fully risen over Harlan County. Reports from law enforcement agencies across 4 states, describing families who had suddenly abandoned their remote properties in the middle of the primed night, leaving behind only empty buildings and the lingering smell of smoke from hastily burned evidence. This coordinated exodus revealed the true scope of what investigators had stumbled upon: not an isolated family of cannibals, but a network of related clans who had been sharing information, techniques, and even victims for over a century. The MacDads were just the tip of an iceberg that extended deep into the most forgotten corners of Appalachian culture, where isolation had allowed ancient hungers to evolve into something resembling a primitive religion. Federal agents discovered that the network operated on a rotation system. When hunting pressure became too intense in one area, families would relocate their operations to territories controlled by related clans. Children who grew up in this system learned to think of the entire mountain region as a single hunting ground, with different families controlling different sections, like feudal lords dividing up a medieval kingdom. Communication between the families had evolved beyond simple word of mouth. Investigators found evidence of coded messages passed through seemingly innocent channels, classified ads in local newspapers, messages left at rural post offices, even signals transmitted through illegal CB radio. Networks that operated outside federal monitoring was raided. Warnings had spread through this communication system within hours. A joint task force report compiled by the FBI and ATF in March 1983 would document at least 7 related family groups operating across Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Each group controlled territory that included popular camping areas, hiking trails, and scenic routes that attracted the kind of isolated travelers who made ideal targets. The feast that traveled. The Buchanan clan in West Virginia had specialized in targeting hitchhikers along remote stretches of Interstate 77. The Crowley family in North Carolina had focused on backpackers using the Appalachian Trail. Each group had developed techniques adapted to their specific hunting grounds, but all shared the same core methodology: identify isolated victims, lure them to remote locations, and dispose of evidence in areas where searches would be difficult or impossible. The network particularly difficult to detect was its careful attention to victim selection. Families chose targets who wouldn't be missed immediately: drifters, runaways, tourists from distant states who had told no one about their travel plans. When victims were reported missing, the crimes had usually been committed hundreds of miles away from where the reports were filed, making it nearly impossible for local law enforcement to identify patterns. The children rescued from these compounds presented unique challenges for social services. Many had never learned to read or write, had no concept of conventional morality, and displayed symptoms that psychologists struggled to categorize. Dr. Amanda Foster, who worked with several of the rescued children, wrote, "These subjects have been conditioned to view predation as normal family activity. They express confusion about why their lifestyle is considered problematic, similar to children of isolated religious cults. But unlike religious cults, which typically claimed divine justification for their practices, the cannibal families operated from a purely pragmatic worldview. They saw their predation as a practical response to poverty and isolation, a way of ensuring survival in environments where conventional resources were scarce." Several family members, when interviewed separately, expressed genuine bewilderment that society considered their practices immoral. Ezekiel McCready, during his interrogation on October 20th, 1982, provided investigators with their first comprehensive look at the network structure. "Been doing this since my granddaddy's time. He learned it from his granddaddy, who learned it from the old country. Ain't nothing new about it, just folks taking care of their own when times get hard. The old country." References led investigators to historical research that revealed similar practices among isolated populations in rural Scotland and Ireland during the 18th and 19th centuries, exactly the regions from which many Appalachian families had originally immigrated. The cannibalism wasn't a recent development triggered by poverty or desperation. It was a cultural tradition that had been preserved and refined across multiple generations. What happens when an entire way of life is built around predation? And how do you dismantle a network that has been operating successfully for over a century? The answer came in the form of Operation Mountain Sweep, a coordinated law enforcement action that would target all known network locations simultaneously, ensuring that no families could escape to continue their operations elsewhere. Even today, hikers in remote areas of Appalachia sometimes report finding abandoned compounds deep in the mountains, empty buildings with suspicious modifications, underground chambers that serve no obvious purpose, and an atmosphere of lingering dread that seems to seep from the very ground itself. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops. Operation Mountain Sweep launched at exactly 4 a.m. on November 15, 1982, with simultaneous raids on 17 locations across 4 states, the largest coordinated law enforcement action in Appalachian history. The results exceeded even the most pessimistic projections of federal investigators. This final phase of the investigation would reveal that the network of cannibal families had been operating not for decades but for over a century, with some family lines tracing their predatory practices back to the 1800s. What had begun as desperate survival tactics during the hardest years of mountain settlement had evolved into a sustainable lifestyle that had claimed hundreds of victims across multiple generations. The evidence recovered during the raids filled an entire FBI warehouse facility in Quantico, personal belongings from victims dating back to the 1920s, photographs that documented family hunts, like other families might document holiday gatherings, and genealogical records that revealed the network's true scope. Over 200 individuals across 12 extended family groups, all connected by blood, marriage, and shared methodology. Most disturbing were the children. 47 minors were recovered during the raids, ranging in age from infants to teenagers, had never seen electric lights or indoor plumbing. Some spoke only in the hybrid dialect that had evolved within the network, mixing archaic English with terms that seemed to come from no recognizable language. All had been raised to consider human predation as normal as hunting deer or raising livestock. Dr. Patricia Henley, the clinical psychologist assigned to evaluate the rescued children, wrote in her final report, "These subjects represent a unique case study in environmental conditioning. They have been systematically isolated from conventional moral frameworks and trained to view behaviors that society considers among the most heinous as routine family activities. The inherited hunger, the adult family members showed varying degrees of cooperation with investigators. Some, like Ezekiel McCrae, seemed genuinely confused by the legal proceedings against them. Others displayed a cunning intelligence that had allowed them to operate undetected for so long, providing minimal information while carefully protecting other network members who might have escaped the raids. Granny McCready, the acknowledged matriarch of the network, proved to be the most chilling interview subject. Her statement to FBI agents on November 20th, 1982, provided the clearest insight into the network's mindset. "Y'all act like we invented something new. Folks been eating folks since the beginning of port time. We just honest about it. At least we don't pretend we're civilized while we're doing it." The trials that followed would stretch across 3 years and result in 47 convictions for various charges, ranging from murder to kidnapping to violation of federal interstate commerce laws, but the legal proceedings couldn't address the larger questions that the case had raised about the nature of civilization itself and how easily human societies could revert to predatory behaviors when isolated from conventional moral oversight. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that the network had maintained detailed records of their activities, treating their predation as a form of oral history that needed to be preserved for future generations. Taught songs that celebrated successful hunts, stories that passed down tactical knowledge, and rituals that reinforced their separation from the soft world beyond the mountains. The last active member of the network, a woman named Sarah Buchanan, was arrested in West Virginia in 1985 while attempting to establish a new hunting ground near the New River Gorge. Her capture marked the official end of Operation Mountain Sweep, but investigators knew that other isolated families might be continuing the practices in locations that had never been identified. Deputy Michael Torres, whose discovery of the McCready compound had triggered the entire investigation, retired from law enforcement in 1984. He moved to a small town in Florida, as far from the mountains as he could manage. But neighbors reported that he kept all his curtains drawn and never answered his door after dark. You do with the knowledge that some horrors are too deeply rooted to be completely eliminated, and how do you sleep peacefully, knowing that isolation and desperation can transform ordinary families into predators? The Mardi compound was burned to the ground by federal agents in December 1982, but local residents claim that smoke still rises from that hollow on certain nights, not from any fire that can be extinguished, but from appetites that were never fully satisfied. Even today, park rangers in remote areas of Appalachia sometimes find abandoned campsites where families have disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only empty tents and the lingering sense that something patient and hungry is still watching from the tree. Operation Mountain Sweep, launched at exactly 4 a.m. on November 15, 1982, with simultaneous raids on 17 locations across 4 states, the largest coordinated law enforcement action in Appalachian history. The results exceeded even the most pessimistic projections of federal investigators. This final phase of the investigation would reveal that the network of cannibal families had been operating not for decades but for over a century, some family lines tracing their predatory practices back to the 1800s. What had begun as desperate survival tactics during the hardest years of mountain settlement had evolved into a sustainable lifestyle that had claimed hundreds of victims across multiple generations. The evidence recovered during the raids filled an entire FBI warehouse facility in Quantico, belongings from victims dating back to the 1920s. Photographs that documented family hunts like other families might document holiday gatherings and genealogical records that revealed the network's true scope. Individuals across 12 extended family groups, all connected by blood, marriage, and shared methodology. Most disturbing were the children, 47 minors, were recovered during the raids, ranging in age from infants to teenagers, had never seen electric lights or indoor plumbing. Some spoke only in the hybrid dialect that had evolved within the network, mixing archaic English with terms that seemed to come from no recognizable language. All had been raised to consider human predation as normal as hunting deer or raising livestock. Clinical psychologist assigned to evaluate the rescued children wrote in her final report, "These subjects represent a unique case study in environmental conditioning. They have been systematically isolated from conventional moral frameworks and trained to view behaviors that society considers among the most heinous as routine family activities." The inherited hunger. The adult family members showed varying degrees of cooperation with investigators. Some, like Ezekiel McCready, seemed genuinely confused by the legal proceedings against them. Others displayed a cunning intelligence that had allowed them to operate undetected for so long, providing minimal information while carefully protecting other network members who might have escaped the raids. Granny McCready, the acknowledged matriarch of the network, proved to be the most chilling interview subject. Her statement to FBI agents on November 20, 1982 provided the clearest insight into the network's mindset. "Y'all act like we invented something new. Folks been eating folks since the beginning of time. We just honest about it. At least we don't pretend we're civilized while we're doing it." The trials that followed would stretch across 3 years and result in 47 convictions for various charges, ranging from murder to kidnapping to violation of federal interstate commerce laws. But the legal proceedings couldn't address the larger questions that the case had raised about the nature of civilization itself and how easily human societies could revert to predatory behaviors when isolated from conventional moral oversight. Most troubling was the discovery that the network had maintained detailed records of their activities, treating their predation as a form of oral history that needed to be preserved for future generations. Children had been taught songs that celebrated successful hunts, stories that passed down tactical knowledge, and rituals that reinforced their separation from the soft world beyond the mountains. Network. A woman named Sarah Buchanan was arrested in West Virginia in 1985 while attempting to establish a new hunting ground near the New River Gorge. Her capture marked the official end of Operation Mountain Sweep, but investigators knew that other isolated families might be continuing the practices in locations that had never been identified. Deputy Michael Torres, whose discovery of the McCready compound had triggered the entire investigation, retired from law enforcement in 1984. He moved to a small town in Florida, as far from the mountains as he could manage, kept all his curtains drawn and never answered his door after dark. You do with the knowledge that some horrors are too deeply rooted to be completely eliminated. And how do you Sleep peacefully, knowing that isolation and desperation can transform ordinary families into predators. Compound was burned to the ground by federal agents in December 1982. But local residents claim that smoke still rises from that hollow nights, not from any fire that can be extinguished, but from appetites that were never fully satisfied. Park rangers in remote areas of Appalachia sometimes find abandoned campsites where families have disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only empty tents and the lingering sense that something patient and hungry is still watching from the tree surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.